Her sisters wed nobles, but the Duke whose power England feared knelt for the forgotten spinster. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. On the night her youngest sister married a nobleman, Eleanor Hartley stood near the rear doors of the great ballroom, half hidden behind a marble pillar, as if the house itself had grown tired of being gracious and simply swallowed her into its shadows. The chandeliers blazed, crystal catching the light like 100 tiny suns, and music drifted through the air, sweet and bright, as Lydia, glowing in ivory silk and pearls, turned in her new husband's arms. Guests watched the couple, not the woman who had arranged every candle, every floral garland, every place card with her careful, invisible hands. Eleanor smoothed the plain dove-gray muslin of her gown, feeling the rough edge where the ribbon at her wrist had frayed. It was not a poor dress, just an unremarkable one, the kind worn by someone expected to be useful, not memorable. Her sisters had worn color and sparkle and hope. Somewhere along the way, those things had quietly been taken from her, piece by piece, and wrapped around them instead. A ripple of laughter rose from a cluster of ladies nearby. Eleanor did not need to step closer to imagine the topic. She had heard the same lines for years, said with polite pity and a touch of entertainment, as if her unmarried state were a small, harmless tragedy that made excellent conversation over champagne. Both younger sisters married so well, someone murmured, the words floating just far enough to reach her. It's almost charitable, really. One might have expected the eldest to go first. Another voice, lower, amused, replied, "Oh, but look how efficiently she manages the household. Some women are born for the altar, others for the accounts ledger." More soft laughter. Eleanor kept her gaze on Lydia, pretending the sting did not reach her. Her mother, Lady Beatrice Hartley, swept past in a cloud of lavender silk and perfume, her smile wide, her pride barely contained. "Both my girls married into the nobility," she declared to a passing colonel and his wife, the words bright as polished silver. There was the slightest, almost imperceptible pause before she added, "And Eleanor, of course, has been such a help to us all." The colonel's wife gave Eleanor the kind of fleeting, distracted smile one offers a maid who has just refilled a glass. Then her attention shifted back to the glittering crowd, to the music, to the future being celebrated in the center of the room. Eleanor inclined her head, as if she had not heard the difference between daughters and help. She knew it well. She had learned it slowly, over years of standing aside, so her sisters could step forward. At the far end of the ballroom, the double doors opened again, letting in a breath of cool night air and a new current of whispers. A tall man entered, dressed in black that seemed to drink in the light instead of reflecting it. His presence moved through the crowd like a quiet storm. People shifted, instinctively making space, as if his very aura rearranged the room. "The Duke of Ravensmere." Someone breathed near Eleanor's shoulder. "They say half the politicians in London lose sleep thinking about his next move." Eleanor's gaze followed the murmur. Gabriel Ashcroft, Duke of Ravensmere, paused just inside the doorway, dark hair slightly disordered by the wind outside, gray eyes sweeping the room with a calm, assessing detachment. This was the man whose signature on a piece of paper could alter the fate of entire counties, whose silence in the house carried more weight than other men's speeches. England respected him. England feared him. He did not look like a man who could be swayed by anyone or anything. For a brief heartbeat, his eyes passed over the distant corner where Eleanor stood. Perhaps it was a trick of her imagination, but she felt the air tighten, as though he had registered her existence for the span of a breath before moving on. No interest, no curiosity, just a cataloging and a dismissal. And yet, on the night her sisters' futures glittered before them like a string of lights, it was that single, fleeting glance from the Iron Duke that made Eleanor Hartley realize just how thoroughly the world had decided she was meant to remain in the dark. The wedding was over by the time the last candle burned low and the musicians packed away their instruments. but the echo of music seemed to cling to the house for days afterward. Eleanor felt it in the way her mother moved through the halls, humming under her breath as if she walked through a dream she had carefully ordered and finally achieved. 2 daughters married into noble families. 2 glittering futures secured. The fact that there was a 3rd daughter appeared to be an afterthought at best. On a gray afternoon, with clouds pressed low over the house and a quiet chill seeping in through the windows, Lady Beatrice sent for Eleanor. The summons came by way of a maid who did not quite meet Eleanor's eyes, as if even carrying the message felt uncomfortable. "Your mother is waiting in the drawing room, miss. You are to come at once." Eleanor folded the linens she had been inspecting, set them aside with automatic precision, and smoothed her hands over her skirt. She had become very good at smoothing things. Wrinkles, budgets, emotions, expectations. The drawing room was warm and sweet with the scent of tea and lemon cake, but there was a tightness in the air that did not match the softness of the decor. Lady Beatrice sat on the sofa, back straight, hands folded just so, her expression composed into a kind of bright determination. Opposite her, in an armchair upholstered in dark green, sat a man Eleanor recognized from dinners and political conversations half overheard. Sir Percival Vaughan. His hair was touched with gray at the temples, his waistcoat slightly too tight across his middle, his smile polite and measured. His eyes, when they lifted to Eleanor, were the calculating sort that weighed and measured rather than simply saw. "Eleanor," Lady Beatrice said, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "you remember Sir Percival?" "Of course," Eleanor replied, dipping a small curtsy. "Good afternoon, Sir Percival." "Good afternoon, Miss Hartley," he answered. His tone was smooth, but there was a faint undercurrent of assessment, as if she were an item on an inventory list he needed to double-check. "Do sit down, dear," her mother urged, gesturing to the single chair placed just slightly off-center, a position that made Eleanor feel as though she were standing on a small island surrounded by expectations she had not chosen. She sat, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. She had learned long ago that the first person to ask a question in such a room often revealed more than they wished to. Lady Beatrice cleared her throat softly. "You know, of course, that your father's health has not been what it once was. Managing the estates and the accounts has become an enormous strain." Eleanor knew. She had watched the numbers more closely than anyone, watched the ink sink into paper like small quiet storms. "Yes, mother," she said. "I am very aware of that. And you understand," Sir Percival added, leaning slightly forward, "that your family has relied upon a series of loans to provide suitable dowries for your sisters. It is, I assure you, a very common practice among families of your standing." His words were gentle, but the structure of them laid out a simple, undeniable fact. "Debt, obligation, terms. I understand that we have benefited from your assistance," Eleanor said. "I have gone over every ledger myself." That seemed to catch his interest. His eyebrows lifted in a small arc. "Indeed, that is rather unusual." Lady Beatrice laughed lightly, as if to soften the comment. "Our Eleanor has always had a head for figures. It is a useful talent, even if it is not the sort of thing that shines at a ball." Eleanor felt the compliment and the diminishment woven together and let them pass. Sir Percival steepled his fingers. "Then you know that the time is approaching when certain notes will come due. It is my desire to make this transition as smooth and as advantageous as possible for all involved." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "There is, perhaps, a way for that to happen." Lady Beatrice's gaze settled on Eleanor with almost painful intensity. "Sir Percival has been incredibly generous, my dear. He has hinted that a more permanent connection between our families could resolve so many difficulties." The meaning unfolded with a slow, cold clarity. Eleanor felt it settle in her chest like a stone. "You are suggesting," she said quietly, "that Sir Percival and I might be married." Lady Beatrice's smile brightened, relieved that the words had been spoken. "It would be a very respectable match. Sir Percival is well placed, well regarded, and he understands our situation. You would have a secure home. Your sisters would not need to fear scandal from unpaid debts. Our lands would be safe." Each phrase was a carefully chosen step on a path that led away from herself and toward duty. Sir Percival inclined his head. "I am not a young man, Miss Hartley, and I will not pretend to offer you the romantic nonsense young girls sometimes dream of. But I can offer stability. Comfort, a name that will shield you from the whispers that can be so unkind to a woman in your position. In your position, of an age people called late, of a family that had poured its resources into other daughters' futures. Eleanor felt the words pressing against her, polite and heavy. This is a great deal to consider, she said. Her voice was calm, but beneath it her thoughts moved quickly through columns of cost and consequence. I would prefer not to answer in haste. Lady Beatrice's fingers tightened on her teacup. Eleanor, you must see how rare an opportunity this is. It is not as if you have a crowd of suitors waiting. We cannot expect miracles. The words were soft, but they carried the weight of years of quiet dismissal. Not the pretty one, not the enchanting one, the useful one. From somewhere down the hall, faint and muted by distance, came the sound of a deep male voice, followed by the rustle of papers. The Duke of Ravensmere had arrived some minutes earlier, summoned by Sir Percival for a separate matter of business. Eleanor had known he was in the house in the same way one feels a shift in weather before a storm. She doubted a man like that would trouble himself with the private negotiations of a nearly forgotten woman and a family trying to stay afloat. Still, for a brief and inexplicable moment, she had the sense that her words in this room might reach farther than its four walls. She sat a little straighter. I do not deny the reality of our situation, she said. I know the numbers better than anyone. But marriage is not a line item on a ledger, Mother. It is not a debt to be balanced or a problem to be erased. Sir Percival watched her with a thoughtful expression, as if recalculating. In light of new information, Lady Beatrice's voice softened, carrying the weary affection of a mother who had convinced herself she was acting for the best. Sometimes, my dear, life allows us one reasonable choice. This is yours. Think on it tonight. We will need your answer very soon. Eleanor rose when she saw there was no more to be said without tearing something fragile between them. She curtsied again, the motion practiced and smooth. Very well. I will think on it. As she left the drawing room, the murmur of Sir Percival's and her mother's voices faded behind her, replaced by the distant cadence of the Duke speaking in her father's study. Eleanor moved down the corridor, the familiar carpet soft beneath her slippers, and for the first time in many years she felt as if the house around her were not simply home, but a narrowing passage, gently but firmly steering her toward a door she had not chosen. The question followed Eleanor through the night like a shadow that refused to lengthen or shorten, simply clinging to every step. By morning she had run figures in her head until numbers blurred with memories. What her mother saw as a solution felt to Eleanor like a carefully wrapped box whose ribbon tightened the more she tried to examine what was inside. 2 days later, a carriage delivered a heavy cream card trimmed in gold to the Hartley home. Lady Beatrice opened it with eager fingers and a smile that Eleanor recognized as the look of someone who could see the finish line. Sir Percival is hosting a small garden party, she announced. He has invited us all. It will be the perfect opportunity to finalize matters in a graceful way. Her gaze drifted to Eleanor, lingering with gentle insistence. There is such kindness in this, my dear. He wishes to offer you respect and attention before everything is settled. Before everything is settled. The words sounded like a door closing on a hinge that had already been oiled. On the afternoon of the party, the sky was a pale, clear blue, the kind that made the world look sharper around the edges. Sir Percival's grounds were well kept, every hedge trimmed, every path raked smooth. White canvas tents were set up on the lawn, sheltering tables filled with small cakes and glasses of lemonade and sparkling punch. Guests strolled between rose beds and marble benches, their conversations rising and falling like the buzz of content bees. Eleanor walked a few steps behind her mother and father as they were greeted. Lydia and Clara had remained with their husbands, who had more fashionable gatherings to attend, so for once Eleanor was not the person arranging veils or adjusting gloves. She was simply there, which somehow felt even more precarious. Sir Percival greeted Lady Beatrice with expansive warmth, kissed her hand, and then turned to Eleanor with a smile that felt practiced rather than spontaneous. Miss Hartley, he said, I am honored that you have joined us. She curtsied. Thank you for the invitation, Sir Percival. Your gardens are very beautiful. They are quite tolerable, he replied, half laughing. But I find they improve significantly when one has agreeable company. Would you allow me the pleasure of showing you the new rose walk? Your mother has already complimented it so kindly. Lady Beatrice's encouragement was almost palpable at Eleanor's back. Eleanor inclined her head and placed her fingertips on Sir Percival's offered arm. The path he chose led them away from the busier part of the lawn, through a small arch of wrought iron and climbing roses that had only just begun to bloom. The air smelled faintly of earth and petals, softened by the distant sound of music from a string quartet under the main tent. As they walked, Sir Percival spoke of weather and politics and the rising cost of imported goods. His words flowed easily, but beneath them Eleanor could feel the moment gathering, the way the air thickens before a summer storm. At last he stopped beside a stone bench set between two tall hedges. Here the sounds of the party were muted, the laughter and clink of glass muffled as if by distance and leaves. "Miss Hartley," he said, turning to face her fully, "I am a man who prefers to speak plainly. It is one of the reasons I have prospered in business. When there is a sensible course, I take it. I believe you are the same. You see what must be done." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I try to see what is true, Sir Percival. The rest follows, or it does not." He smiled, but there was a hint of strain at the corners of his mouth. "Then you must recognize the sense in what I proposed. Your family's burdens would be lifted. You would have a comfortable home, a position of respect. No more whispers about an unmarried eldest daughter left behind while her younger sisters rise." His hand came to rest over hers where it lay on his arm, his fingers closing in a way that was a shade too firm, as though he were afraid she might simply dissolve into mist if he did not hold on. "I have given you time to consider," he continued. "Surely you see that this union is not only reasonable, it is generous." Eleanor felt the pressure of his hand, the closeness of the hedge at her back, and an odd stillness settled over her. Fear did not come. Instead, there was a clear, cool awareness of her own thoughts. "I see that it is convenient," she said quietly. "For you. For my family. I am still deciding if it is right for me." His fingers tightened slightly. Not enough to bruise. Only enough to remind her that he expected cooperation. "A woman in your situation cannot afford to be overly romantic, Miss Hartley. You are past the age when other offers will appear. I am trying to save you from a more uncomfortable future." She drew her hand back, carefully, deliberately, until his fingers had no choice but to release her or clutch in a way that would appear very improper should anyone glance their way. He chose to release. "I am grateful for your concern," she said, "but my future is not an error for you to correct." Silence stretched between them for a heartbeat, taut and fine. Somewhere beyond the hedge, a man's voice spoke in an even, composed tone, followed by a murmur of response. The sound drew closer with each step. Gabriel Ashcroft, Duke of Ravensmere, appeared at the end of the rose walk a moment later, his dark coat a sharp line against the soft greens and pinks of the garden. He was alone, save for the faint echo of a conversation he had clearly just left behind. His gaze took in the scene with a quick, comprehensive sweep. Eleanor standing with her hands clasped in front of her, Sir Percival facing her with a stiffness that suggested a conversation not going entirely to plan. "Sir Percival," the Duke said, his voice courteous but cool, "your staff assured me I would find you near the Rose Walk. I hope I am not intruding." Sir Percival cleared his throat, smoothing his expression into an approximation of ease. "Not at all, Your Grace. Miss Hartley and I were simply discussing a matter of some personal significance." Gabriel's eyes shifted to Eleanor, and this time the glance did not slide past her. It rested, observed, waited. "Indeed," he said. "Has Miss Hartley accepted your offer, then?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Eleanor felt both men watching her now, one with expectation, the other with something harder to name. She drew a breath that tasted of roses and decisions. "No," she said clearly. "I have not." For a moment after Eleanor spoke, the garden seemed to hold its breath. Even the faint rustle of leaves and the distant notes of the string quartet felt suspended, as if the world were waiting to see what Sir Percival Vaughan would do with a woman who had dared to answer him so plainly. Color rose along his collar, a slow flush that did not suit a man used to hearing yes before he had finished forming the question. "You have had ample time to consider, Miss Hartley," he said, his tone still smooth but edged now with something cooler. "I had understood your family appreciated the gravity of their circumstances. I had expected you to be realistic." Eleanor met his gaze without dropping her eyes. Inside, her heart beat hard enough that she could feel it in the tips of her fingers, but her voice remained even. Realism and consent are not the same thing, Sir Percival. You asked whether I had accepted. I have not. The softness of her words did nothing to lessen their clarity. Gabriel Ashcroft watched the exchange with a stillness that had unsettled more than one opponent in Parliament. He had spent years reading expressions on the faces of men, trying to conceal fear, or greed, or guilt. What he saw now in Sir Percival was not simple irritation at being refused. It was calculation interrupted. A plan knocked slightly off balance. Then I was mistaken, Sir Percival replied, turning slightly toward Gabriel as if that might restore his advantage. I had been under the impression that Miss Hartley understood the nature of the offer. It is most unusual for a lady in her position to hesitate when given such a prospect. Her family situation is not one that invites many alternatives. The implication hung there, pointed and impersonal, as if Eleanor were a column on a ledger they were discussing over tea. A narrow pathway of crushed gravel ran just beyond the rose arch. Two guests began to wander down it, drawn by the scent of the blossoms. Their conversation faltered as they caught sight of a duke, a knight, and an unmarried gentlewoman standing in a tableau that did not quite match the easy charm of a summer party. Gabriel felt their attention like a breeze at his back. He also saw the way Eleanor's shoulders straightened, as if she sensed that whatever was said next would not be fully private. A lady's position, Gabriel said, his voice calm, does not remove her right to consider her choices, Sir Percival. Nor does a family's debt convert a daughter into collateral. Sir Percival's smile grew tighter. With respect, Your Grace, this is a family matter. One that Miss Hartley and I can settle between ourselves. I meant no offense to her dignity. Gabriel had heard that word wielded as a shield and a weapon more times than he could count. I imagine Miss Hartley's dignity requires no defense from me, he answered. But since my name has been involved in your enterprises, I would prefer to be certain that none of them involve pressing unwilling parties into agreements under the guise of financial necessity. There was nothing raised in his tone, no open accusation, but the air changed. The two approaching guests suddenly found the roses on the other side of the garden very interesting and turned away, though not before casting one last curious glance. Sir Percival inclined his head in a small bow. Of course, Your Grace. I would never wish to be seen as anything other than honorable. The words sounded correct. The muscle ticking in his jaw did not. He turned back to Eleanor. I will not insist upon an answer today, he said. I would, however, advise you to think very carefully about the consequences of refusal. For yourself, for your family. Eleanor heard what remained unsaid as clearly as what he spoke aloud. He left her with a courteous nod and walked away, his steps measured, his shoulders held stiff and square. When he was gone, the space he left behind felt oddly sharp. The Duke watched him until he disappeared around the curve of the path, then looked at Eleanor again. Up close, he could see the faint imprint where Sir Percival's fingers had rested too firmly on her glove, the crease left behind by tension and release. If I have overstepped, Gabriel said, by speaking just now, I will apologize. I do not make a habit of inserting myself into the personal affairs of families I barely know. Eleanor let out a breath that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. I think you make a habit of inserting yourself only where the outcome matters very much, Your Grace. I do not know that I qualify. He regarded her for a moment, studying the quiet composure that seemed to cloak her the way other women wore jewels. On the contrary, he said slowly, it appears you are positioned precisely where a number of outcomes converge. That tends to interest me. She could not tell whether that was meant as reassurance or a simple observation. Behind them, the party continued, unaware of the small fault line that had just been drawn. You will find, Eleanor said, that my family prefers not to think of it that way. They simply wish this particular column in their accounts to stop causing them trouble. There was no bitterness in her tone, only a weary clarity. Gabriel had seen generals speak with that same kind of resignation on the morning after a difficult battle. Numbers can be read in more than one direction, Miss Hartley, he replied. Sometimes the column others would cross out is the one that reveals where the problem truly lies. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat Eleanor felt something shift, though she could not have named it. Respect, perhaps, where she had expected only disinterest. It left her both steadier and more unsettled at once. Later, As the carriages rolled away from Sir Percival's estate and the summer light thinned into evening, Lady Beatrice's frustration filled the interior of the Hartley coach like a second, sharper air. "You embarrassed him," her mother insisted, fanning herself in short, agitated motions. "You embarrassed all of us. Do you have any idea what it means to refuse a man in his position when we are so dependent on his goodwill?" Eleanor sat opposite her, hands folded around the small reticule in her lap. "He asked a question," she said quietly. "I answered it honestly." Her father stared out the window, lines etched deeper than ever into his face. He did not speak in her defense. He did not speak at all. That silence settled deeper than any scolding. By the time they reached home, the path before Eleanor felt different. It was no longer a narrowing hallway steering her toward one door. It was a house she would have to leave if she wished to remain herself. That night, while the rest of the family slept and the grandfather clock in the hall counted out the hours with soft, patient chimes, Eleanor opened her small trunk and began to fold inside the few dresses she had truly chosen for herself. London was a distant word, a cluster of streets she had never walked, but she knew it held schools and households that needed governesses and companions who could read, calculate, and listen. She had been those things all her life. Perhaps, somewhere beyond the walls of the only home she had ever known, that might finally be enough. Gabriel's decision moved the entire inn-yard like an invisible hand. The driver of the public coach bowed and muttered that the schedule would be easier to keep with one fewer passenger. The two men who had been watching Eleanor earlier seemed suddenly very interested in checking their horses' saddles, as if their original plans had dissolved under the weight of a duke's presence. Eleanor gathered her reticule a little closer to her side and allowed Gabriel to escort her to his carriage, aware of the sturdier construction, the polished dark panels, the discreet crest worked into the door. Inside, the air carried a faint scent of leather and paper, clean and restrained. Cushions softened the seats, not so much as to invite idleness, but enough to suggest this was a vehicle meant to carry decisions as much as people. Opposite Eleanor, Gabriel settled into his place with the unthinking economy of a man accustomed to motion and control. Outside, the coachman called to the horses, and the carriage rolled forward, leaving the inn, the public coach, and its uncertain company behind. For several minutes, there was only the sound of wheels and hooves, and the occasional distant bird. Eleanor watched the landscape shift through the small window, hedgerows blurring, into a muted green ribbon. The sense of exposure she had felt on the public coach eased, replaced by a slower, more curious unease. She was now alone in a confined space with the man whose name newspapers used as shorthand for power. "You are very quiet, Miss Hartley," Gabriel observed at last. His tone held no reproach, only an attentive interest. "Are you reconsidering your journey, now that you have exchanged one unknown for another?" She turned her gaze from the window. "No, Your Grace. I am simply adjusting to how quickly a day can change its shape. This morning I was a passenger among strangers who cared nothing for my name. Now I am seated across from the Duke of Ravensmere, being carried toward the same city, but by an entirely different road." A faint glimmer of amusement touched his eyes. Roads to London have a way of converging in the end. The question is what one finds upon arrival. He paused, then added, "You mentioned that you are seeking a governess position. Does that truly content you?" "Contentment is not always a matter of grandeur," Eleanor replied. "It is often the ability to choose one's duties. Teaching children to read and think seems preferable to being asked to accept a life that feels like a transaction." Gabriel considered that, his gaze dropping briefly to the gloved hands resting in her lap. "You understand transactions." It was not quite a question. "I understand numbers," she said. "And when people attempt to hide things inside them. My father did not enjoy ledgers. Someone had to." He leaned back slightly, the motion small, but revealing a shift from politeness to deliberate inquiry. "Then perhaps it is fortunate that our paths cross today. Sir Percival's business affairs have attracted my attention for some time. There are discrepancies in certain accounts connected to ventures he promotes in Parliament. Sums moved, balances adjusted, reports that do not align. I have seen them from one direction. You have seen them from another." Eleanor felt a thread of cold recognition. "Some of those sums belong to us," she said. "To my family. I have wondered why the terms of our loans shifted so often, why new fees appeared that no one could quite explain. You questioned him? Gabriel asked. On paper, yes, she replied. His answers were always very polite and very vague. My parents were simply relieved that someone was willing to advance us more time. The carriage rattled gently over a patch of uneven road, then smoothed again. Outside, the light began to tilt toward evening. In London, Gabriel said slowly, I have need of someone who can look at a set of figures and see what is missing rather than only what is written. My own staff are capable, but they do not have your particular vantage point. You have watched Sir Percival's influence from the receiving end. Eleanor's heart beat a little faster, though not from fear. Are you asking me to work for you, Your Grace? He shook his head once. I am asking you, for a short time, to work with me. You may still present yourself to Mrs. Harrow and these prospective employers. I will not stand between you and the life you choose. But until those arrangements are secure, I would prefer that you remain in a place where Sir Percival's reach is less likely to trouble you. My townhouse offers that, and it offers you access to the documents I cannot very well hand to a stranger in a public dining room. She thought of the looks in the inn yard, of the way the two men had drifted away when Gabriel appeared. Sir Percival's displeasure might not have been more than wounded pride yet, but wounded pride in the wrong man could grow into something far less harmless. If I agree, she said carefully, I will be under your protection, and I will be assisting in an inquiry that could damage a man whose name is already tied to my family. That is not a small thing to ask. I am aware, Gabriel answered, which is why I have not called it a request. I will not coerce you. If you prefer, I will see you safely to a respectable lodging and leave you to your own plans. But I believe you deserve to know that the very debts used to press you toward an unwanted marriage may be the key to uncovering something far larger than one household's misfortune. The sky outside had deepened to a soft blue, the first lamps of scattered villages beginning to glow. Eleanor looked at the fading light, then back at the man whose choices seemed to bend other men's paths. I have spent years watching numbers move without understanding who was pushing them, she said. If I can help place even a few of them back into honest lines, I would like to try. I will assist you, Your Grace. For a time, a small nod acknowledged the decision, yet in the quiet that followed, something unspoken settled between them, as if the carriage itself understood that this agreement was not only about ledgers and laws. It was about a woman stepping from the margins of her own story into a place beside a man the country respected and feared, not as ornament or burden, but as a mind he had chosen to trust. London greeted Eleanor not with fanfare, but with a steady hum, the kind of sound that suggested millions of small lives moving in complex patterns beneath a gray sky. Gabriel's carriage passed from the outskirts into narrower streets lined with brick houses and iron railings. At last it turned toward a quieter square, where trees grew in neat rows and lamplighters were just beginning their evening work. The townhouse that belonged to the Duke of Ravensmere stood a little back from the square, for stories of pale stone with tall windows and a door painted a discreet dark blue. It did not shout for attention. It simply existed in a way that made the buildings on either side seem to rearrange themselves around it. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with beeswax and old paper. Portraits watched from the walls, their subjects long dead but still dressed for company. The staff moved with practiced efficiency, greeting their employer with respectful nods and brief words. When their eyes slid to Eleanor, curiosity flickered, quickly masked by good training. Gabriel explained her presence with the same calm simplicity he used for all practical matters. Miss Hartley will be staying for a time as a guest, he told his housekeeper, Mrs. Kersey, a woman with silver threaded through her dark hair and an expression that combined kindness with unyielding standards. She will require a room and a desk in the study. There is work we must review together. Mrs. Kersey inclined her head. Of course, Your Grace. Miss Hartley, if you will follow me, I will see you settled. The room Eleanor was given overlooked the square, its single tall window framed by curtains the color of storm clouds. It was not lavish, but everything. And it was thoughtfully chosen, a bed with a carved headboard, a small writing desk, a washstand with a porcelain basin patterned with blue flowers. Eleanor set her reticule on the desk and touched the surface lightly, feeling the grain of the wood. This was not her home, not yet, and perhaps never. but for the first time she sensed she might be permitted to exist somewhere without being constantly measured against the futures of others. After a brief rest and a tray of simple, well-prepared food that arrived as if the house had anticipated her needs, she was summoned to the study. The room was everything she had imagined from the man who occupied it. Shelves lined the walls, heavy with books and ledgers. A large desk dominated the center, its surface neat but not empty, as if it were the stage upon which thoughts arranged themselves before stepping out into the world as actions. Gabriel stood by the hearth, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, reading a sheet of paper. He looked up when she entered, the lamplight drawing faint lines of weariness at the corners of his eyes that had not been visible in the open air. "Miss Hartley," he said, gesturing toward a smaller table set perpendicular to his desk, already laid out with several ledgers. "These are copies of accounts connected to Sir Percival's ventures. Some are public, others are not meant to be, but they have come into my possession through channels I trust." Eleanor moved closer, her curiosity sharpening. Columns of numbers marched across the pages in ink of varying shades, some neat, some hurried. Here and there, small notes had been added in a different hand, questions without answers. "You believe these connect to the loans made to my family," she said. "Among others," Gabriel replied. "He has extended credit to several households, often tying those personal obligations to larger financial schemes that influence how members of Parliament vote. On the surface, it appears as clever but ordinary patronage. It is the undercurrent that concerns me." Eleanor ran her finger just above a line of figures, not quite touching the ink. She saw at once where sums had been rounded in ways that did not make sense, where interest had been recalculated to disguise a change rather than clarify it. The pattern that had disturbed her in her father's accounts unfurled. Here with a wider reach, like branches emerging from a trunk she had not previously seen. "He increases the pressure on families he thinks will be most desperate," she said slowly. "Then he uses their gratitude to sway their votes, or the votes of those connected to them. It is not only money he is moving. It is influence." Gabriel watched her with a steady attention that made her aware of each word she chose. "Precisely," he said. "You see why I wish for your eyes on this. There are things a man in my position cannot claim to know without revealing his sources. There are also things that those who sit comfortably in their seats fail to see because they have never had to wonder whether their homes might be taken from them." She looked up at him. "You have had to wonder?" His gaze shifted briefly to the fire, where a low flame burned, steady and contained. "Not about a house," he said. "About lives. About men whose futures hung on the lines I signed. War has its own kind of ledger, Miss Hartley. I carry the totals whether I wish to or not." There was no flourish in the way he spoke, no attempt to impress her with the weight of his regrets. That made them heavier. For a moment, their separate experiences balanced in the quiet between them, numbers and names and choices laid out on an invisible scale. Then he inclined his head toward the ledgers. "Tell me what you see," he said. "We will start there." And as Eleanor took her seat at the smaller table and bent over the pages, she realized that for the first time in her life, someone with true power was not asking her to disappear behind the work she did. He was asking her to step fully into it, to let her skills be seen, and to help shift the lines of a story that had always been written without her. The night of the reception arrived like a test the city itself had set. London glittered under a sky of soft cloud, lamplight gleaming on wet cobblestones where a recent drizzle had darkened the streets. In the mirror of the small dressing room offered to her, Eleanor hardly recognized the woman who stared back. Mrs. Kersey and one of the maids had worked quietly, smoothing her hair into an elegant arrangement and fastening a gown borrowed from a distant cousin of the Duke's. The fabric was a deep blue, simple but well cut, the color of the sky just before dawn. It did not shout for attention. It simply allowed her to be seen. When she descended the staircase, Gabriel waited in the entrance hall, already dressed for the evening. For a fraction of a moment, his eyes widened, the barest shift before his usual composure returned. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice even but warmer than usual, "London may find itself unprepared." She let out a soft breath that might almost have been a laugh. "I suspect London will recover, Your Grace." The carriage carried them through streets that grew more crowded and bright, past other houses where guests were arriving in a shimmer of silk and polished boots. The reception itself was held in the home of Lord Weatherby, a man whose influence was not loud but deep. The entrance hall rang with the sound of voices, the soft thud of footsteps, the rustle of gowns. As Gabriel and Eleanor stepped inside, heads turned in a slow, inevitable wave. Whispers followed like a second, more secret layer of sound. That is Ravensmere. Who is she? Surely not a relation. I would have heard. Gabriel offered his arm. Eleanor placed her hand lightly on his sleeve, feeling the strength there, not as a claim, but as a steadying line drawn between them and the room. He introduced her as Miss Eleanor Hartley of the Hartley family of Somerset, a guest of his household assisting with certain matters of business. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The fact that he had named her in front of these people was declaration enough. Sir Percival Vaughan arrived soon after. Eleanor saw the moment he noticed her, the way his smile froze for a heartbeat before he reshaped it. He approached with the assurance of a man who still believed he had the upper hand. "Your Grace," he said to Gabriel, bowing. "I had not expected to see you here tonight. Or Miss Hartley." His eyes flicked over her gown, her hair, the hand resting on the Duke's arm, and something cold moved behind his gaze. "London is full of surprises." "Indeed," Gabriel replied, his tone courteous, "although some of them are less pleasant than others. It is good to see you, Sir Percival. I was just speaking with Lord Weatherby about the clever financial instruments you have been promoting. They have certainly made you a great many friends." Several nearby gentlemen, drawn by the prospect of an interesting conversation, drifted closer. Eleanor recognized two names from the ledgers, men whose estates had benefited from adjustments that made no honest sense. Sir Percival's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I merely offer opportunities, Your Grace," he said. "Those who are wise enough to seize them cannot be blamed for their success." Wisdom is an interesting term, Gabriel mused, particularly when the cost of that success is quietly shifted onto those who have fewer choices. I have been studying the pattern of certain loans. It is fascinating how stress in one household seems to coincide with generosity in another, almost as if you are moving strain around the board, Sir Percival, rather than removing it. A murmur went through the small circle. Sir Percival's gaze flicked to Eleanor, as if he could push the blame toward her with sheer will. "I imagine Miss Hartley has filled your head with tales of hardship," he said lightly. "Families in reduced circumstances rarely see their situation clearly." Eleanor felt the eyes in the room slide toward her. Once, that weight would have pressed her back into silence. Now, with Gabriel beside her and the memory of ledgers open under her hands, she found that her voice did not tremble when she used it. "On the contrary, Sir Percival," she said, her tone calm, "reduced circumstances tend to teach clarity very quickly. When every change in a column can mean the difference between keeping a roof or losing it, one learns to read what is actually written, not only what one is told to see." One of the gentlemen closest to them, a member of Parliament whose name had appeared several times in Sir Percival's adjusted accounts, looked at her with new attention. "You have examined these matters yourself, Miss Hartley?" he asked. "In some detail," Eleanor replied, "both in my father's books and in copies of others. Patterns rarely lie. People sometimes do." The words hung in the air, soft but unmistakable. Sir Percival's color rose, then faded. He opened his mouth as if to protest, then seemed to think better of it under the combined weight of the Duke's cool gaze and the suddenly watchful faces around them. Gabriel did not press the advantage cruelly. He simply inclined his head, his voice deceptively mild. "It is only right that such questions be asked in the presence of those who are affected," he said. "I am certain, Sir Percival, that you will be eager to provide full transparency when they are raised in more formal settings." For the first time since she had known him, Eleanor saw uncertainty cross Sir Percival's features. It was fleeting, but it was real. He excused himself with a stiffness that no amount of polished manners could hide. As he retreated into the crowd, the circle around Gabriel and Eleanor shifted. Men who had once looked through her now looked at her, not as a decorative mystery, but as someone whose words might carry weight. The knowledge settled over her like a cloak she had never been allowed to wear. She stood a little straighter. Gabriel glanced down at her, and though his expression remained composed, there was quiet approval in his eyes. In that moment, surrounded by power and scrutiny, Eleanor Hartley understood that she was no longer the forgotten sister pressed into corners. She was, at last, standing where the light could find her, and beside a man who had chosen not to shield her from it, but to stand with her inside its full, revealing glare.